Hello, with me is Revd Dr Richard Turnbull. Richard is a trustee of the Christian Institute. He's also director of the Centre for Enterprise, Markets and Ethics. Richard is an ordained Church of England minister and was a minister in the church for 10 years. He sat on the General Synod, he sat on the Archbishop's Council, principal of Wycliffe College for 7 years. But Richard, you're also the author of a book about the life of Shaftsbury, and really it's your interest in history that I want to talk to you about just now. So as a historian, Richard, why would you say it's so important for Christians to understand church history in particular?
Well, Ciarán, it's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about these things. And you know, a lot of people hated history at school. They were put off learning about our past because often it wasn't taught well, or they didn't enjoy it, or it was narrowly focused on dates and kings and queens and so on. But as a Christian, what you realise by looking back in history is how God has used great figures in the past to achieve amazing things for his kingdom. And today, as Christians, we can be inspired by what God has done through individuals in the past. I mean, you know, we're sitting in a room that is called the John Newton Centre. John Newton was a slave trader. He used to captain ships going back and forth across the Atlantic. He described himself as a great blasphemer. And then he met God, and God changed his life. And he then came into contact with William Wilberforce. Wilberforce was thinking of leaving politics. He was thinking of leaving national life. Sought out John Newton, who was the minister of the church where he attended. And Newton persuaded Wilberforce to stay in national life. Why is that important? Because Wilberforce was the key figure in the abolition of the slave trade and the abolition of slavery. And we can be inspired by that story today because it's an example to us of the way in which God acts in history.
Richard, we believe that Christians can be an influence in a secular world. That's our strapline at the Christian Institute, and that they have been throughout history. So you've mentioned one in terms of Wilberforce, or touched on Wilberforce. What would you highlight as some of the other most important areas where we can say that it was Christian thinking that shaped or perhaps reshaped the worldview of society as a whole, that had an impact outside of the church?
Sure. I mean, actually, there's a whole list of things. We probably don't have time to go through them all, but let me just pick out a couple of examples. If you go back to the time of the Reformation, the 16th century, what you discover there was that the whole idea of an educated laity, an educated people of God, a taught people of God, became central to the whole Christian message. Why is that important? Because of education. And so education became a central feature in Christian thinking, in Christian teaching, and in Christian practice. And so in the hundreds of years since the Reformation, it was Christians who were primarily responsible for establishing schools. So Robert Raikes, who was the editor of the Gloucester Journal, established the first Sunday schools. Hannah More in the Mendip Hills out in Somerset took that idea and applied it in her locality. And literally hundreds of thousands of people came into the Sunday school movement. And then you move into the sort of the 19th century, and you found Lord Shaftesbury establishing what was known as the ragged schools. A very strange term, we would think, today, but their purpose was to provide Christian teaching and wider education to the children, or to poor children in London and elsewhere. And they saw no contradiction between teaching people to read and write, teaching them the Bible, and teaching them the message of salvation. Why should those things be separated? And they were volunteer schools. They were schools in which Christian men and women volunteered to be the teachers. So the people would work all day, or they would manage their homes all day, and then in the evenings they would be staffing these so-called ragged schools. They would provide meals, they would provide teaching, and they would also provide training in a trade. So they would teach people to be shoemakers. They would teach children to be tailors, so that as they were enabled to live a full and flourishing life. Why did Christians do that? Christians did that because children are created in the image of God, and it was an example of how the Christian message could transform society. And I mentioned earlier in our discussion, Newton and Wilberforce and the slave trade. Wilberforce campaigned against the slave trade, was it for 17, 18 years, every single year introducing a resolution in Parliament. Lord Shaftsbury, 50, 60 years later, it wasn't the African slave trade, it was child chimney sweeps. Yeah. And year after year after year, he introduced resolutions into Parliament. So the tenacity of these people, they never gave up. They knew that they were campaigning for God's society, if you like, and their personal conviction drove them in order to bring about these changes and these transformations, but never losing sight of the fact that they were Christian and that they were converted people.
You mentioned Shaftesbury a couple of times, and as I said in the introduction, you've written an acclaimed work on Shaftesbury. What was it that attracted you to him as a subject for historical writing?
Yes, that's a really interesting question. And I think the answer to that is that I was attracted by Shaftesbury for two reasons. And the first is he stood really in succession to Wilberforce. So here was an individual who used his Christian convictions and the Christian message to change society. And in that sense, that was very similar to what William Wilberforce did with slavery. But the second thing about Shaftesbury is that his Christian commitment was passionate. He was, I suppose we might say, an ardent evangelical. He really believed in the message, and he saw no contradiction between trying to bring moral reformation to society, defeating social evil, and alongside all of that, proclaiming the evangelistic message of the gospel. The time of the celebration of the anniversary of the Reformation, a lot of statues and monuments were put up in 1850 as a celebration of 300 years of the Reformation, and in that whole period. And Shaftesbury just toured the country, appearing at these commemorations, advocating the teaching of the Reformed doctrines. And there's a famous story in the 1860s of when he was taken into the depths of a London slum to meet some of the most hardened, convicted criminals in London. He's taken by a London city missionary called Thomas Jackson. And here was this kind of aristocratic gentleman going into this slum in order to sort of meet these hardened criminals. What a strange sight. What did he do? He preached the gospel, and then he introduced them to opportunities and schemes for them to lift themselves out of the mire in which they were in. So that was the sorts of things that attracted me.
And you've said a couple of times now that these people, Shaftesbury for one, saw no contradiction between preaching the gospel, the need for salvation, and let's say the social action and the need for enterprise and what have you. Do you think that the church today does see a contradiction?
Yeah, I think so, in some respects. And it can be a complex question, but the beauty of the examples like Shaftesbury was precisely that. He understood the faith to be a public faith, not a private faith. He understood the faith to be something that required him to speak in Parliament and to seek social change. But he was very sceptical about the role of the state. And so even though he advocated legislation against social evil, he saw it primarily as a Christian responsibility, a responsibility of the people of God to actually act in order to improve people's lives. I think the problem today is we've sort of separated body and soul in such a way that it become an either-or. But actually, that's not the way God views us. God views us as our body and soul as united. God views us as whole human beings. And so the more holistic we can be, so the better it is for the Christian message.
Although, of course, you would recognise that so much social good is done by those who aren't believers, who are in God's common grace, are able to work in various areas of society and do good there as well.
And of course, and we know that from the Bible, that God works and acts through people who are not necessarily part of his people. And that's because it's God's world that we live in. And God's world is a world in which all sorts of individuals in all sorts of conditions live and inhabit in need of the gospel. But that's why we need Christian politicians. It's not that politicians themselves don't do good. They do seek to do good, but you need, the bread needs to be leavened. So you need the Christian there to focus on that message. But God works through all sorts of people in all sorts of ways and in all sorts of settings because it's his world. But he calls Christians to operate in that setting and in those contexts.
And what would you say to Christians who are perhaps fearful that going down this road is somehow just to advocate a social action gospel, or are concerned that it's going to take primacy over preaching the word, or are concerned that perhaps people like you, people like the Institute, are trying to put in place some sort of Christian state, just moralism? What would you say to people who are fearful of going down some of those routes?
Well, first of all, there is a very big difference between the social action of the gospel and the social gospel. I don't advocate the social gospel. And what I mean by that is a gospel that effectively is so diluted that it becomes either liberalism or socialism or some other form of ism. Moralism and so on. So it's very important that we distinguish between the appropriate social action of the gospel and the social gospel. The social gospel is not the way I would seek the church to go. But in terms of the social action of the gospel, the gospel does have implications. The gospel has implications for individuals, of course. The gospel also has implications for society. And we're enjoined in Scripture to pray for our leaders, to pray for our governments. And actually, in Scripture, government is a divine institution. And Calvin wrote about the role of government as something that should encourage the flourishing of society, not just protection against evil, but it's both those things, really. So I think there is a proper place for a healthy social responsibility of the gospel, both in moral terms and social terms. But I don't think that's an ism. I don't think it's socialism. I don't think it's humanism. I think it's simply the holistic and wholeness of the gospel. And of course, one of the great things about Shaftsbury was that he never lost that tenacity for the proclamation of the faith. I think I said earlier it was sort of 1850 when he was going around doing these meetings. I think it was a bit later, actually. I think it was 1867, of course, which was the 350th anniversary of the Reformation. And I think what we need to do today in the contemporary church is help people understand we need both of those things. We need the proclamation of the Christian gospel, and we need to recognise that that gospel will affect God's world in which we live.
Well, that's a great place to finish. Richard, thank you very much for taking the time out to speak to me today.